All right, welcome everyone. This is Dr. Clark from the Center for Weight Loss Success, and today on Losing Weight USA, we're going to talk a little bit about thyroid and some of the thyroid basics. We're not going to get into too much detail here, but just kind of an overall look at thyroid. Welcome to Losing Weight USA, real-time answers to your weight loss questions, some of the latest updates in research, as well as a little bit of expert advice. Gives you direct access not only to me, but you should be receiving the health tips and recipes via the membership portal if you think of questions. And I do encourage you to get into the membership portal. I say this every week. We keep adding more and more things in there, but it has all these webinars that are recorded, but also all the behavior modification classes, exercise videos, recipes. They're all in there. If you think of questions during this webinar, just type them into the chat box as we go along. We'll get to them at the end as time permits, and typically we'll make time permit. If you think of things once we're all done, just give us a yell. The email is success@cfwls.com. Phone number 757-873-1880. And please stop by and see us at our new office location. Office location is 711, that's 711 Brick Kiln Boulevard in Newport News. It's just next to Kiln Creek. It's just off Jefferson Avenue, easy to get to. All right, okay, so today we are talking about thyroid. So, seen this probably, and I say this almost weekly when we start talking about hormones, that with all hormones, balance is key, absolute key. So I won't kind of belittle that point, but I'll keep going on there. And endocrine glands, and there are many of them throughout the body. They're endocrine glands. The hormone, it is a chemical messenger. I say this all the time. It goes to a certain tissue and gives it a message. In order to receive the tissue, it has to have the receptors for that hormone. So the thyroid is just another one of these hormonal tissues that secretes hormones, sends message to the rest of the body. All right. So yeah, only the tissue then that has the right receptor then can actually respond to the hormone. And so it's that lock and key concept. And homeostasis then is kind of that's a whole thing with hormone balance. So hormone balance, again, is a key concept. Thyroid hormone, just as true as any other one, and especially true with that. So when we start talking about just thyroid hormone, of course, they end up interacting with many different hormones with each other. And a lot of this initial interaction comes from the pituitary gland. And so when we start talking about hormones, just about every hormone I talk about, at some point, the base of the brain, the pituitary gland, comes into play. And if you're looking at the slides on here, it just has a little drawing of the pituitary gland. And really the whole point of that slide is that the pituitary gland itself influences so many different hormonal tissues. And it's how the message sent to that tissue, the endocrine tissue, starts from the pituitary gland, subsequently sent out to the tissues. The endocrine gland itself receives that and then secretes their hormones in relation to that. So there's kind of a number of steps, and this is true with just about every hormone we talk about. There are multiple steps, and there are typically multiple feedback loops that have to occur, and they have to be working correctly for this hormone balance to actually occur. All right. Thyroid gland actually sits in your neck. It's just below the voice box there, larynx. Okay? And it's a relatively, when we look at hormone size of glands, it's a relatively large endocrine gland, but it's actually a fairly small gland. Okay? It's found in the neck, again, just kind of around. And the thyroid gland itself comes from a Greek word for shield, and that's because it's shaped somewhat like a shield. And it's separated into the right and left lobe with a little connecting point in between, or isthmus that connects the two sides. But it does look somewhat like a shield. It's pretty well protected by our neck muscles. Okay, but obviously with the neck, there just aren't that many structures in there. The important structures are leading up to the brain, as well as then leading down into the abdomen and your chest and your lungs. But then there are also the muscles and soft tissues surrounding it as well. So the thyroid gland sits there, but also the parathyroid. The parathyroid glands regulate your calcium levels. Okay? Thyroid gland is more your metabolism. Okay? But the parathyroid glands, because they're next to they're next to the thyroid gland, are also adjacent then to it. All right, and the thyroid gland itself really regulates your overall metabolism. Okay, so it truly drives your overall metabolism. And it does this by speaking to literally every single cell in your body. So literally every single cell in your body is going to have thyroid receptors on it. And so having appropriate thyroid levels is a key part of maintaining your overall metabolism, maintaining your overall health. Now, if you're looking at the slides at all, there's a little slide up there, the microscopic view of thyroid tissue. And the thyroid tissue, even though it looks like a solid glandular thing, is made up of tiny little follicles, and they're filled with the thyroid hormone, though. And the little lining of is actually the thyroid tissue there. And they secrete into these little nodules, and their nodules are pretty well microscopic unless there's potential problems, and that's where cysts can develop or thyroid nodules can develop. There's some enlargement of the thyroid gland, which we'll talk a little bit more in a couple of minutes. So when we talk about balanced thyroid, I alluded to this just a couple of minutes ago, talking about these feedback loops, because it's just not the thyroid by itself, but it's going to receive, the thyroid has to receive messages typically from the brain and the pituitary gland, and subsequently then it sends out messages as well. And there's these feedback loops where it can measure how much has been made because it's in the bloodstream, and subsequently how much is going out to the tissue, how much is actually there. And there are feedback loops all along this. So it's a fairly biocomplex system, but it tends to work very nicely. The other thing it's very, very dependent on, the thyroid gland is dependent on having the amount of iodine that it requires. And iodine has typically been added to salt, and and that's one of the reasons that it was added to salt is because iodine deficiency was so common, and so they added it to salt, and subsequently then most people got enough iodine. Now, the amount of iodine that is in iodized salt, I'm going to digress here for a minute, is actually minuscule. So the majority of people typically don't get enough iodine. There isn't a whole lot of iodine in a lot of different foods. Okay, the food that often it's going to be leafy greens and things like that that may have extra iodine. Meat will have some extra iodine, but typically there isn't a whole lot in a lot of the foods that we eat. So we're getting it often kind of through the soil, whether it be through the food or kind of be some in water. And there are going to be different ways of obtaining it. But the point of really that is that many people really don't get enough iodine. Right? Iodized salt helps with that. But if you think about it, now so many people are so careful with how much salt they have, or they don't use iodized salt. Plus, one other thing with that is that many of us, I'm included in this, when we buy a big thing of salt, think of that big container of iodized salt has a little Morton salt, I think it has a little girl with the umbrella on it. And so subsequently we buy that, we fill our salt shaker, and then we set this kind of container in our pantry, and the salt shaker sits there for around. Unfortunately, the iodine itself can actually easily kind of be evaporated up into the air. And so subsequently then, even though it may have started out with lots of iodine in the salt, is that because once we've opened the package and it's exposed to air, the iodine itself is going to be evaporated off, and subsequently then there's very often very little iodine within the salt itself, even if it has been iodized in the past. So all of this if you don't get enough iodine in, can lead to a poorly functioning thyroid. And one of the biggest things we're going to talk about in a few minutes is what you can do to actually help keep your thyroid working as good as possible is add some extra iodine. Okay? So, but poorly functioning thyroid and not enough iodine will subsequently lead to a poorly functioning gland, but also a goiter. And that's where most goiters actually in the past came from low iodine levels. There can be other reasons to get goiters now as well. And a goiter is just the overgrowth of the thyroid gland itself, which can, in extreme cases, become incredibly large. Okay? And if you see the pictures, again, there's pictures of an incredibly large thyroid, but it also can be very subtle too, because the thyroid can be very large, but actually it's not so noticeable. Now, sometimes it can be so enlarged it actually impinges on the other structures there, from the breathing, the trachea that goes through that we're breathing in and out. It actually push on the esophagus, may make it harder to swallow, can push on some blood vessels around there, making blood going up or coming back from your brain more difficult. So there are a lot of potential issues that an enlarged thyroid could actually cause. But often an enlarged thyroid is really a very subtle change and isn't so noticeable. So again, the thyroid system itself, it's not just the thyroid gland itself. It actually starts up in the brain with what's referred to as an area of the brain called the hypothalamus, which then talks to the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland then talks to the thyroid. And again, there's all these feedback loops in there to try to keep things where they should be. But just realize that there are multiple steps, multiple feedback loops, that if any of them go awry, can potentially cause some problems. And really, when we boil it down, is why is that an issue? Is because, well, in the long run, about at least 20% of the population is going to develop thyroid problems throughout their lifetime. A little more common in women than it is in men, but literally anybody can get a thyroid problem. And subsequently, if you look at just minor abnormalities, that number probably is closer to 40% or so, not just 20%. But 20% will get diagnosed and subsequently be on extra thyroid hormone. Now, the thyroid hormone, again, the whole bottom line to thyroid is keeping your metabolism as normal as possible. All right, so how do we check for that outside of just feeling your thyroid gland, which is that's very inaccurate test itself. So we can actually look at thyroid function tests. So to see if the thyroid is functioning pretty well, there are certain tests that can be ordered. The screening test is typically TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone is the hormone that's made by the pituitary gland that is sending the message from the pituitary gland to the thyroid itself. And so if there's enough thyroid circulating in the body, then the pituitary gland does not secrete much of the TSH. But if there weren't very much, then subsequently then the pituitary will secrete more of the TSH to try to get the thyroid working more. So the screening test is TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Part of the problem here is that thyroid stimulating hormone is a very inaccurate screening test. And because there are many people that have fairly normal amounts of TSH, but their thyroid gland itself isn't working quite up to snuff. And so even though it is the screening test, it's not a very good screening test. So what you really want in your body, in the tissues itself and all the rest of the tissues, is enough of the actual thyroid hormone. And thyroid secretes two of the major hormones. It's referred to as T3 and T4. The 3 and the 4 after the T refers to how many iodine molecules are actually on the thyroid hormone. If you have the slide there, the picture on the right there just shows a diagram of the T3 and the T4. The T4 has 4 iodine molecules on it. The T3 has 3 iodine molecules on it. So what's the big deal there? Okay, mainly the thyroid secretes T4. That's the main hormone it secretes. Unfortunately, T4 is a kind of a non-functioning hormone by itself. It has to be converted to T3. So it's T3 that's actually the working hormone. And the potential problem there is that T4 made in plenty amounts will tell the brain that, hey, you don't have to secrete too much TSH then. Okay? And actually, but you still have to convert that T4 to T3. And many people don't do that very well. And that's where kind of the problem can come in, as the T4 needs to be converted to T3, and that occurs in the peripheral tissues, kind of the tissues outside of the thyroid gland itself. And T3, again, is the active hormone, and it's actually the free T3 that is the active hormone. When I say free T3, it means that it's not connected to any other protein. It's just the hormone itself, the free T3, that's the active hormone. And only a tiny percentage of the full T3 hormone is unbound, and is that free T3. So there are places, I guess my point there being is that there are places where there can be stumbling blocks. And subsequently, without checking all these different places, you don't really know how well is the thyroid truly functioning. Again, TSH is the screening test itself. Now, X-rays to look at that, often we'll use ultrasound. Ultrasound is a good way to look at the thyroid gland. There are some radioactive iodine scans that can actually look at some thyroid functioning, as how well it's actually functioning. All right, so again, the physiology really is that you want the free T3. That is the working hormone now. Part of the problem, again, is those thyroid mainly secretes T4, has to be converted to T3, but that T4 can also be converted to something called reverse T3. And unfortunately, reverse T3 basically means it's just kind of a backwards T3. And by doing that, though, it tends to be fairly non-functional. So even if kind of it is being, the T4 is being converted, if a lot of it is going to reverse T3, subsequently then you're not getting the working hormone again. And so there are many places, or a number of places, that the stumbling blocks that can occur in this thyroid physiology. So which can lead then to hypothyroid, which means you have an underactive thyroid, or hyperthyroid, which means you have an overactive thyroid. It's more common to have hypo. Hyper is a little bit easier to diagnose, and one, because the symptoms tend to be a little more obvious. Part of that is that, gee, you may have a little excess higher heart rate. You may the eyes may bulge a little bit. They tend to be very hot in nature. They have more sweating. The gland itself may or may not actually be enlarged. Okay? And then there also can be other vague symptoms. And this is, again, talking about hyperthyroid. And part of that is that a lot of these symptoms for both hypothyroid and hyperthyroid are relatively vague, meaning that, gee, I'm a little tired. I have a little, I don't tolerate cold or heat as well. I'm a little more fatigued. I have some, menstrual irregularities. I may have a little bit of muscle loss, or I feel like I'm, not feeling up to snuff. There are a lot of little things that are fairly vague symptoms. and subsequently then just checking the screening test, the TSH, may or may not truly get to the bottom of the whole, what's the problem there. Hypothyroid, probably more common, but often may be underdiagnosed. Okay. And again, because a lot of these symptoms are relatively vague, and a lot of other things can actually, add to the symptoms. Is that, gee, I'm more fatigued. My hair seems a little drier. My skin seems a little drier. I've got some hair loss, some hair thinning. I have a little more aches and pains, a little more cold intolerance. I'm a little bit depressed, a little more forgetful. Little things like this, weight gain, constipation, brittle nails, all can be signs of hypothyroidism, but they can also be signs of innumerable other things too. And that's part of the problem with diagnosing this, is sometimes a little bit more difficult than just saying it like we're here. So there's a significant overlap in all of these symptoms, and subsequently makes it a little bit more difficult to diagnose. But it sometimes requires an endocrine specialist actually to kind of look at that, to kind of, okay, sort through some of these things. So what can you do then to help prevent problems? Okay, it's like, gee, I'd like my thyroid to work as well as possible. Well, I alluded to one of them is potentially adding extra iodine, which you can buy, you can get at most pharmacies over the counter. Okay, there are a lot of different ways. There isn't a whole lot of food that has a whole lot of extra iodine in it. Some seafood will, kelp typically does have extra iodine in it. How many of us eat kelp though? But again, coming from the sea. All right, so outside of just the extra iodine, what else? So there are a number of products out there for what we call thyroid support or thyroid health. Most of them will have some extra B vitamins in them. They also will tend to have extra selenium in them, some iodine, extra zinc, copper, chromium, and then there may be some herbal blends in there. Some of them may actually have small amounts of true thyroid tissue that's been dried and ground into there, either coming from pigs or cows, that they have very similar thyroid as us. So a lot of I digress for a second, is that a lot of the natural thyroid comes from either pig or cow thyroid glands, and subsequently they're just dried, ground up, and that's what kind of, the natural thyroid, that's what we're referring to. It has a mixture of both the T3 and the T4. Now, just to take that a step further, for anyone that's been diagnosed with low thyroid, they're often put on something called Synthroid or levothyroxine. Okay, levothyroxine is T4. Okay, Synthroid is T4. And again, some people don't convert T4 well to the T3. And if you're one of those people, if they're giving you all kinds of Synthroid, levothyroxine, and it may make the TSH say, hey, it looks like it's good, your thyroid's good, but it may not actually be functioning well, meaning that if you don't convert that T4 to the T3, which is the working hormone, is that you're not going to feel that well. It's like, well, my symptoms are all still there, even though your numbers look good. Okay? And so some people that don't do well with just straight T4 do much better when they use a natural thyroid, which is a mixture of both the T3 and the T4, and it comes from either pig or cow thyroid glands that have been dried and ground up. All right, so thyroid support, and we do carry this in our nutritional support. It's basically referred to as iodine plus, and what it has is some of the herbal things in there, but also the selenium, some extra zinc, and so those are the main ones that really tend to really kind of give the thyroid the extra support that and it gives obviously the iodine as well. I'm a big fan of of taking extra iodine. Most people don't get enough iodine. Um, the RDA is a minuscule number. Just realize that the RDA has nothing to do with what an optimal amount is. The RDA is kind of the absolute smallest amount that will prevent a deficiency syndrome. So kind of the absolute smallest amount that will prevent hypothyroidism. It has nothing to do with what will actually be an optimal amount, which is many times more than RDA. All right. Questions out there. I don't see any questions sitting out there, but thyroid is something that's very, very common. Problems that are very, very common, and subsequently ought to be evaluated. Often it's just a screening test. Just realize that many people, even if their screening test looks good, if they still have a lot of the symptoms, even though they're vague symptoms, potentially should get further testing to get the full panel, to get the thyroid test to see if there is something that can be treated there, which is very easily treated. All right. So if you think of questions, give us a yell here at Center for Weight Loss Success. Again, email success@cfws.com. Phone number 757-873-1880. And then, yes, stop by and visit us at our new store. Okay, our new office location, which again is 711 Brick Kiln Boulevard in Newport News, Virginia. All right, okay, so stop in and get your body comp done, but also make sure you're logging into the membership portal every week. You should be receiving the weight loss tips as well as weekly recipes. Tune in each Tuesday, 12:15 for the next webinar. Watch your email for the invited link. And remember, it's your life. Make it a healthy one. Have a good day, everyone. Take care.